You want to stay there for the chat?
I'm going to stay there.
It looks
like you're looking at the camera there.
That's a kind of a long distance chat. How long do you want to stay chatting for? How fast do you want it now? Do you want to brief or?
Which one?
The chat.
We'll see.
You want to see how that goes? Okay. Do you want to be blathering on if you only want a few minutes?
No, fine.
No, what am I to play? I might start with a slow air. Wait till I think before you start rolling. Yeah, whenever you tell me so.
Okay, so what's the name of this tune?
The name of it is A Storm of Cree. Okay.
Would you start first of all, tell us about your family, your grandparents, or on both sides, where they came from?
Both grandparents were from County Waterford. My father's people were from the Ballyduff Kilmeaden area and have lived there as long as that I'm aware of anyway. And my mother's people were from around Kill, between Kill and Munmahan. Although her mother was actually a South Kilkenny woman. She was from Ballinlaw. But generally they were from around the Waterford area.
And what was the name? What was the names of your mother's people?
My mother's name was Casey, and her father was Casey, obviously, and her mother was a Whalen from Ballinlaw in just out beyond Sleebrew there.
Ballinlaw is a famous place.
Yes.
and where did the music come from?
There was certainly music in my father's family. His uncle Peter played the flute. His own parents didn't play, but his brothers played. His brother Dick played the box, and he played the fiddle. So they seem to have had an interest in music, I suppose, like a lot of people in that time. There was music in the locality, and also, of course, the 78 record and the gramophone started to become popular. My father was born in 1916, so I suppose his interest in music would have come in the 20s and 30s. And he learned to play the fiddle in school. There was a teacher who came around, an Italian man, and he started them playing, I suppose, classical music originally. And my father was one of his pupils, and another musician who became quite famous in London afterwards, a man called Jimmy Power, who played quite a lot all his life in London and has a number of LPs out, I remember, in the 60s, and he was called to us. So the two of them were the two, I suppose, musicians that came out of that particular group, you know.
Oh, was this in Tramore?
No, in Ballyduff.
Oh.
Yeah, in Ballyduff. That's the Ballyduff near Kilmeaden here, yeah.
Okay. And when did the family arrive in Tramore?
My father came to Tramore in the mid-40s, I think just about after the Second World War, maybe about 1946. And he had met my mother previous to that. She played fiddle as well. And they met, I think, at some type of maybe a talent contest or something, or a concert in Kill, in the hall in Kill. And they got married, I think, around 1946. And they came to Tramore, and in fact stayed originally just across from where we are now. He was working for lodges at that time, and he was here since 1946 till he died about 10 years ago.
And did he play all his life then?
He did. He literally played from the time he was in school, and in the 1950s started a Ceilidh band called the Tramore Ceilidh Band, and they played quite a lot around the country. I suppose for maybe 10 or 15 years, while Ceilidh bands were popular from the mid-50s probably till the mid-60s. That's my recollections as a child. There were always music in the house because they were practicing for the Ceilidh band. They used to go to Dublin once a month, or to play in a hall in Parnell Square, and all over Munster and all over the country really for a while. But I think the show bands came along then kind of through the 60s, and the Ceilidh started to wane. But there was always, I recall, the GAA club kept up the Ceilidhs for a long time after others stopped them. And I think Stephen's Night always in the Silver Slipper here in Tramore, there would have been a GAA Ceilidh. So they're my kind of earlier memories of hearing the music. But as I said, they used to practice quite a lot at home. And when I was a young kid, I'd be left up the odd time to listen to him playing.
It's funny because, I mean, you wouldn't necessarily associate Tramore with trad music.
Maybe not so much as you would associate sort of other parts of the country, but there was a reasonable bit of music around the Waterford area. I mean, you had Tommy Carney in Waterford, who was a good piper, obviously. And, it probably wasn't as prevalent here as it might have been in parts of Clare. But there was obviously enough musicians around to keep it going anyway in times when it was maybe quieter.
And I know Donegal mentioned there was someone way back, like Chap Talbot, is it?
Yeah, that must be a good while back. I've heard of him, but I don't know what period he lived in, but he was a piper apparently and lived in Tramore, yeah.
So it's interesting, it's like little pockets of trad music happening. And like when you were small then, what was your first instrument?
Probably the tin whistle, I'd say. But I was fortunate at home that there was always lots of instruments left around the house. We didn't have a telly, and there was no, obviously you couldn't, you had to entertain yourself somehow or other, I suppose, but there would always have been fiddles, tin whistles, there was a flute, banjos, guitars. The house was full of instruments, and I suppose fortunately my mother never asked us to tidy them away or put them away. So it was a small house, so it was very easy to get at them. It wasn't as if they were in a specific place that you'd go to play. They were just left around. So, as I said, they were very seldom put back in the case.
And do you have brothers and sisters?
Yeah, I have two sisters. Both had an interest in music, both Greta and Noreen. My sister Noreen kind of gave it up, though she lost interest in it, I suppose. But my sister Greta has played all her life. She played with the Ceilidh band. Greta was a bit older than I was, so she was at an age where she could play with them, whereas I was a bit young. And she's continued playing to this day. As I said, my uncle played, so there was lots of music around.
Would you give us a tin whistle there?
Yeah, no problem.
Tin whistle there, since you're talking about it.
I might try a reel, the Bird in the Bush, I think is the name of it.
that, I was just thinking about, did you ever do the rain out here?
No, I don't think there was a great tradition of it around Tramore particularly. And I didn't do it anyway, so...
and then, would there be always sessions in your house then growing up?
There was fairly constant music in it. My earlier memories, as I said, as a kid, and being listening to the music and getting in under the table and the tablecloth so that I'd be left there to might notice me, or my parents telling me to go to bed because the older people had come in, and generally the older guys would say, "Oh, sure, leave him alone, leave him sit up and listen to the music." So they're my kind of earliest memories of hearing music. So it was always live music really at home, or the odd time on the radio, maybe Kieran McMahon or some other trad music programme, but I suppose my upbringing was mainly listening to Irish music. There wasn't... I was aware of other things around, but the music wasn't played that much in our house. But I mean, you'd hear it, obviously, if you went down around the amusements, you'd hear different music.
And would there be many singers coming into the house?
There was singing with the Tramore Tales band. Nora Cowman used to sing, and she'd frequently be in the house, and the Cowman family are all good singers to this day, or all her children. She would have sang quite a bit in the house, yeah.
And who else was in the Cayley band that time?
In the Cayley band, you had my mother and father, my sister Greta, my uncle Dick. You had Dick Flynn playing the drums. Tony Kelly used to play the concert flute and the tin whistle. And Nora Cowman used to sing. They were the main names that would come back to me now. They had various other people who played with them from time to time. I hope I'm not forgetting anyone now, because I was probably 8, 9 or 10 at that stage, so I mightn't be 100% accurate.
And I mean, they would be, if they were off playing Cayleys off up the country, they'd be home very late, wouldn't they?
They would, yes, yeah.
So did you have someone mind you then?
Well, I had my other sister would always have minded me when they were away, yeah.
So you were the baby, right?
Exactly.
And then, like, growing up then around Tramore, what were the shops that you remember, or the places you remember going to as a child?
I suppose the main shop in Tramore that I would have remembered would have been Lodges, because my father worked there. He came as a baker to Tramore in the 40s, and Lodges, as you know, had a grocery shop, and they also sold coal, and they sold feed for animals and that type of thing, and they had a hardware shop. So that was kind of the dominant shop at the top of the town. And in that stage, of course, all the stuff was weighed out. I remember that as a kid. It was pre-supermarket days, obviously. And biscuits and sweets and all of those would have been weighed. And you had the people who worked in the shop behind the counter. And my mother, who would have been shopping during the war years for her own mother, used to even refer to going down as to getting the rations. I often wondered where it came from, but as I got older, I realised what getting the rations meant. It was a throwback to the Second World War, obviously.
And did Lodges then have their own bakery?
Lodges had a bakery in the 40s, and it subsequently closed down, I think, when they got involved in the Gold Crust in Waterford. I think a number of bakeries amalgamated or were bought or whatever at the time. And some of the small bakeries in the place seemed to close down and were replaced by the Gold Crust. And
did you go to CBS?
Yeah, I went to the CBS here in Tramore, and after primary cert then went into Mount Sion. And for all my secondary education, and then after Mount Sion went on to UCC.
And what did you do in UCC?
Civil engineering.
I mean, that must be fairly unusual at the time for a young man to get to university, wasn't it?
It was. I did the leaving cert in 1971, and in the class, I suppose when I started in Mount Sion, there would have been 4 classes of maybe 30 people in first year, and then a lot would have dropped off by intercert year, third year. So the numbers going on to leaving cert would have been a bit less, and then I suppose of the 25 or 30 who were in my class, probably 5 or 6 would have gone to third level education. At that time, the IT was just starting in Waterford, so there was no... Waterford, I suppose, suffered from having no third level facilities really through the 60s. Whereas I was surprised when I went to Cork to discover that all the A classes in all the secondary schools automatically the entire class moved on to UCC. whereas it was much more difficult because obviously you had to arrange accommodation and all the rest of it, you know.
And did, at that time in Mount Zion, did you do everything through Irish?
We did Gachrod, Trí Gaeilge, yes, including Latin and French and maths, everything.
And you didn't mind that as well?
No, I liked it. Yeah, I always had a huge interest in Irish. No, it wasn't difficult. And it didn't present any difficulties afterwards because you tend to pick up the terminology anyway in English from just everyday life. No, it was interesting.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because I mean now you have grade schools and all that.
Yes.
But like it was unusual, I suppose, in a way.
It was. I think Mount Zion was probably the only secondary school, certainly in Waterford, that were teaching everything through Irish. But it certainly made the Irish part easier. Maybe the other part's a little more difficult, but again, in some of the subjects like maths, it didn't really matter a lot because you were mainly dealing with figures. But it was a little trickier if you were trying to translate Latin into Irish and Irish into Latin, for example.
And Tom, just go back to the Irish music. Was there a Cultus in Tramore at that time?
There wasn't in Tramore, but there was one started in Waterford. Sean Dunphy in Waterford would have been one of the earlier people behind the starting of Cultus. And I certainly remember going into it, and we, as you know, with the nature of Cultus, there would have been kind of competitions and various things like that, and I certainly remember participating in those, where it was, I suppose, more formal in that you'd have dancing, playing, singing, like a kind of a concert type thing for an hour or whatever. And they used to have regular sessions actually in Philly Grimes' pub at that stage.
Upstairs or downstairs?
Upstairs in Philly Grimes, yeah.
And tell me, would it be always, I mean, did you always participate in sessions everywhere? Like, wherever?
I did from the time I was young, yeah.
And like, would that be included in Tramore and Waterford and places like that?
It would, yeah. I suppose what happened in the later 60s, the kind of the ballad thing started, particularly when you had the Clancy's, the Dubliners and all the various ballad groups that became quite popular. And the kind of Cayley band thing started to die out. And you got the bigger pubs, tended to have live music in them. And I suppose the focus moved across to more the ballad kind of scene. And you had that running through maybe until the 70s, where then there was a slight change again towards back to more traditional things when you had groups like Planxty and that coming out. So there was probably a 10-year period where ballad singing was very popular, and guitars and banjos and kind of people trying to emulate the Dubliners or the Wolf Tones or somebody else at that stage.
It's funny because there's all different, goes in circles and goes in swing. And tell me, would your father have disapproved of people like Planxty at that time? No, I think his taste in music was quite broad, even though he just played trad music. He liked good music of any shape or form when he'd hear it, yeah. Because, I mean, they brought it back again, didn't they, to an interest for young people in trad music? I
think so. I suppose the big change originally was back in the 60s when Sean O'Riordan started Ceoltóirí Cúlin. And the music moved on from kind of Cayley band music where people played all together to, in Ceoltóirí Cúlin, each individual musician played a little bit and then they all kind of came in together at the end. And I suppose for a lot of people it was the first time they heard the bodhrán being played as much with Irish music. And maybe O'Riordan brought a bit of kind of, I suppose, it was just the way it was all put together and arranged. And then coming out of that, I suppose you had the chieftains. So there was a certain evolution, but the basic music, I think, was strong and good there because the musicians they had were individually very good musicians. And the same then when you came to groups like Planxty, for example, where you had Liam O'Goflane playing the pipes. I mean, you know, he was obviously a top-class musician.
And very sad that he passed away recently.
That's right, recently, exactly, yes.
That's lovely, Tom. Would you finish with a tune on the flute, just to finish off?
Okay. Let's see what I might try.
What you can come up with.
So thanks very much.
Now, hope you can make something out of it.
No,